The last time we discussed the ancient pilgrims and what they saw in Jerusalem, relevant for the question whether or not this here, what is being seen on the screen, was the Temple Mount or the Roman fortress. Now the question I want to address here is how the people came to believe that this was the Temple Mount. This picture here is often shown as evidence that the temple had to be on the Temple Mount. After all, these stones were thrown off the Temple Mount, so therefore these stones were from the temple. So therefore this mount was the Temple Mount, or reasonings along those lines. As if there couldn't be any other building on top of that mount, as if it is to be expected that those stones were laying there for 2,000 years without being reused. Now that begs the question, where does the idea comes from that this is the Temple Mount? And that is a serious question, because this type of arguments, for instance the stone arguments, is of course not the basis or the origin of that idea, or for the hypothesis that this is the Temple Mount. But it's a type of opportunity arguments to support an already existing conviction. Now this conviction goes back to at least the 7th century, when Abdul Malik put the Dome of the Rock there. He was convinced that he has put his shrine on the former Jewish temple site. But Abdul Malik himself wasn't from Jerusalem, so he was being told. And who were there at that time to tell him? Now, not many Jews, but mainly Christians. And that begs the questions, how did the Christians know? And if they knew, did they have any incentive to tell Abdul Malik the truth? Or did they have any incentive not to tell him the truth? Concerning the question whether or not the Christians did know the location, the answer is most likely yes, but that isn't obvious. There were still Christians in Jerusalem in the 60s of the 1st century, the Messianic Jews, so to speak, but most of them, if not all, did leave Jerusalem in or before 68 AD and went to Pella, according Eusebius and Epiphanius, old church fathers. And after the destruction of Jerusalem, there was nothing left to return to. So it is to be expected that knowledge about the former topology of Jerusalem was lost when the generation that had seen the temple and Jerusalem was gone. Now, Christians did return to Jerusalem in significant numbers when Helen, the mother of Emperor Constantine, herself a Christian, went to Jerusalem and kick-started the pilgrim tradition. And by that time, either the remnants of the trials to rebuild the temple during the Bar Kochba revolt 200 years before, or the remnants of the temple of Jupiter that Emperor Hadrian had built on that location instead, were most likely still there. The Romans were still in charge, and nobody would dare to remove it up until Emperor Constantine. And if not, the few inhabitants of Aelia Capitolina, as Jerusalem was called in those days, could have informed the arriving Christians, who were very interested in the topic of the layout of Jerusalem as it was in the time of Jesus. Or, in case they didn't know, the officers of the Roman legion could have informed them. It is possible that the Roman legion in Jerusalem was still the 10th legion Titus did leave behind. And without a doubt, Constantine and the bishops were familiar with Josephus. So anyway, I don't think it was that difficult in the year 300 or 320 to figure it out, the layout of Jerusalem. The situation in the Jewish community was different. Most of the inhabitants of Jerusalem that survived the war with Titus were either sent to the mine or sold as slaves, and very few, if any, ever returned to Jerusalem. But there were still Jews living in Judea and Galilee, and that is relatively close by. And the Jews still knew when they returned to Jerusalem prior to the Bar Kochba revolt. So they arrived there 10 years before they were defeated. So that is 50 years after the destruction in the year 70. The information about the temple location was kept in the collective memory, for sure, with those many Jews still living in the vicinity of Jerusalem. Well, they might not have visited Jerusalem that often as they used to. The days of the Jewish festivals in Jerusalem were over. But there were still thousands and maybe even 10,000s of Jews living in the land of Israel, not being very happy with the situation, by the way, which resulted in the Bar Kochba revolt in 130 AD. And after this third revolt, the Romans were so fed up with this rebellious bunch that the whole country was crushed. After this intervention by the legions of Emperor Hadrian, there was nothing left. Nothing. The land was emptied. Their land was renamed to Palestine. The few surviving Jews were banned with the instruction never ever to return. And the few that survived flew to Mesopotamia, to North Africa, to Europe. So, at the end of the 2nd century, there was no collective memory anymore about the location of the temple among the Jews, except maybe for the written accounts, but despite the tendencies among the Jews to preserve every snippet of written text, apart from Josephus, there is nothing as far as I know. So imagine a Jew living in Damascus, not that far from Jerusalem, in his late 30s or 40s, having heard about Jerusalem and the temple a gazillion times, decided to ignore the directives of the emperor and go to Jerusalem in the year 200 AD. What does he see? He sees a Roman fortress, he sees the rubble, he sees the shrine of Jupiter. There is a small settlement not being called Jerusalem, and the inhabitants pointing toward the rubble as the place where the temple stood when asked. And these were the ingredients of the story told in his family and in his synagogue for the century that followed. Rubble, Jupiter, citadel, and Romans, in no particular order. Now, I'm not saying not a single Jew knew, but 99% did not. We once had a temple in Jerusalem, but it's destroyed, and that's a tragedy we commemorate yearly. That's what the Jews knew. Now, in the 3rd century, the first pages of the Talmud, the Mishnah, were written, more focused on the law and its interpretation than on the temple. And if it was about the temple, then it was more about the size and the orientation than on the precise location. And its size has become impressive in this narrative. So by the time of the 4th century, for the few Jews that dared to have a look for themselves, they did find a Jerusalem that was called Jerusalem again, so that was positive, but inhabited by Christians, Gentile Christians, churches left and right, on odd places, places of torture, churches on burial sites, the Roman Praetorium, and when they asked those Christians where the temple had stood, they pointed to a place where their temple from the Mishnah wouldn't have fit. Would you believe a Christian that was almost a rhetorical question by that time? And then, entering the scene, the Muslims. With the Byzantine governmental infrastructure and the protection it once offered, having left the scene. And it didn't take long for the Muslims to start planning for a Muslim shrine or mosque or both, preferably on the most holiest sites available. And the question was, where are those sites? And did the Muslims knew? Now, of course, they knew about the Jewish temple, once in Jerusalem, and they knew about the Christian narratives as well associated with Jerusalem. But that didn't mean they knew the exact locations. Now, with regard to the Christian holy sites, it was quite obvious. There were churches built on all of them, and although it must have been tempting for the Muslims to put their shrines there, the problem with these sites was that Allah had revealed to the Muslims that Allah had tricked the Christian into believing that Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried. But that had never happened. And to put a Muslim shrine on top of a place that commemorates an event that never happened, well, that would be silly. So they went for the most holiest places of all, the location where the Jewish temple once stood, in order to put the shrine there and to proclaim the inaccuracy and falseness of core Christian doctrines. That was what you call two birds in one stone. So, what did they write in this shrine? Well, I can tell you. God is one and has no associate. Mohammed is his messenger. But O people of the book, do not exaggerate in your religion. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was only a messenger of God. So believe in God and his messengers and say not three. God is only one God, far be it removed from his transcendent majesty that he should have a son. His is all that is in heaven and all that is in the earth. It befitted not the majesty of God that he should take unto himself a son. God himself is witness that there is no God save him, the Almighty, the Wise. And those who formerly received the book, disbelieved the revelation of God, will find that God is swift in reckoning. Well, that's what's been written on this shrine. And as I said, an Islamic proclamation on the falseness of Christian belief on the Jewish holiest site. Or at least that was the aim. Could say that apparently bettering Christians was more important to Abdul Malik than to commemorate the flight of Mohammed from this very spot to Mecca per horse through the skies. That might be either a matter of priorities or a matter of chronology. Well, but that's a topic for another day. The process to determine the right location of the Jewish temple by Abdul Malik that's what we have to discuss now. What was the process preceding the building of this dome? Now, there are plenty of scenarios for that process to consider. All of them got the location wrong, with deception, distrust, deceit, and ignorance as key components. So, after entering Jerusalem, the Muslims did start asking around, where is the holiest site? And amidst all types of impressive churches and basilicas, the inhabitants were pointing toward an unimpressive site in the proverbial shadow of the citadel, covered by either rubble or some tiny houses. So, something like this. Now you can imagine the response of the Muslims. Yeah, sure. And you think we Muslims are going to believe that? From you? You know what? We'll ask those 3 Jews that happened to be here in Jerusalem for the first time on a sentimental journey. Hey Jews, don't be afraid. Where was your temple? First Jew. Well, according to Josephus, the traitor, it was just south of the Roman fortress, so here, pointing towards the unimpressive site. Second Jew. No, that site is way too small. Our Mishnah describes a huge temple. It must have been there, pointing towards the citadel. On the south side. Third Jew. Yes, according to our Mishnah, the temple was enormous. It must have been right there, pointing to the citadel, right in the middle. First Jew again. No, if the temple was on that citadel, it must have been on the northwest side of it, close to the fortress of the Romans. That isn't there any longer, apparently. Stop. I got it. 3 Jews, 4 opinions. That is useless. You know what? We'll ask the bishop. Hi, Bishop. How are you today? We are looking for the most holiest site around here. And the majority of the Jews are pointing to the citadel. And your people are trying to convince us that an unimpressive site below the citadel is the site of the former temple. Now, if we can't settle the matter on the Jewish temple site, we might go for your Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Well, the bishop starts thinking, shall I tell them the truth? Which will either lead to the destruction of the houses of members of my congregation, or if they don't believe that, it might lead to the confiscation of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or else I suggest a more appropriate site, the former Roman military camp, which might have the grandeur they are looking for. And 0.1 second later, the bishop stood up and said, "Follow me, I'll show you." And the rest is history. Now, of course, the audio tapes of that time are lost, so it is somewhat speculative, but the point being, in this critical phase, when the Byzantine infrastructure was collapsing and the Muslims took Jerusalem by force, it were the Muslims that decided to build the Dome of the Rock on this location. But the process leading up to the selection of this site, well, it is very easy to imagine a process full of ignorance, distrust, deception, and deceit. In the next video, I will return to Josephus and we'll discuss the towers, something I promised to do in the second or third video. Thank you for listening.